Welcome to Kregel Publishing. Hi, my name is Herb Bateman. Today we want to discuss a book entitled Jesus the Messiah, Tracing the Promises, Expectations, and Coming of Israel's King. Today we have with us one of the authors of that book, Dr. Darrell Bock, New Testament professor here at Dallas Theological Seminary. Darrell, welcome.
Glad to be with you.
All right. Well, actually, we worked together on this project.
That's exactly right. You could interview yourself.
I could interview myself, but it's much more entertaining if the two of us do this, I guess.
Maybe for you.
Let me begin by asking, what might you say is the thesis, the overriding thrust of the book?
Well, the major thing we were trying to accomplish in the book was to lay out a consistent hermeneutical reading of the use of the Old Testament for presenting Jesus as Messiah by thinking through not just direct prophecy, but also the use of what's called pattern prophecy in fulfillment, and also thinking about how the progress of Revelation helps you to put the pieces of those promises together into a coherent whole.
Okay. As you think back on the book, we divided the book into parts. What are those three parts, those three segments, and what were we trying to do in each one of those parts?
Well, Gordon Johnston was responsible for writing the Old Testament portion, laying out what is happening with each of the passages, particularly short and long-term fulfillments related to many of the passages that end up being used messianically in the New Testament. Then our distinguished Herb Bateman took the Second Temple Jewish period dealing with the intertestamental texts and showed how various themes tied to messiahship, and particularly coming out of the Old Testament, were woven together in a variety of ways in that period. And then I took the New Testament and dealt with how the New Testament then handled that material, selected certain themes out of the Second Temple period alongside drawing on what the Old Testament was doing to present Jesus as the Messiah.
Okay, well, good. What spurred you, or what was the driving force for us to sit down and do this project? What was the catalyst that drove us to write this thing?
Well, I think the major catalyst is that there's a lot of stuff on Jesus the Messiah that simply puts two passages next to one another, the Old Testament passage and the New Testament passage, and really ignored what was going on between those two periods of writing in a significant way. And so our desire was to trace that clearly, to explain how passages, many of them have both a short-term understanding and a long-term understanding that applies to Jesus, rather than thinking of exclusively as simply direct prophecy and direct prediction. And that actually added a level of depth and a level of importance to how these texts worked, and we wanted to trace that in some detail, go through the options, explain why we thought this is a better way to read the text than those who simply really see mostly direct prophecy in these passages.
Okay, well, good. Okay, so how might this book be a profitable book for a pastor to purchase and work their way through this project, or even a student who wants to look at Scripture and the big picture of Scripture? How does this book help a pastor or a student understand the concept of Messiah?
Well, what it does is it shows passage by passage how that teaching is developed in terms of biblical theology and in terms of the hermeneutics of how that works. And so it allows for both an understanding of what's going on contextually with the passage in its original Hebrew Scripture setting, as well as what's going on in the New Testament. And that combination is helpful as you build the pieces together of getting a full portrait of what Messiah is about in the Bible. So very helpful to pastors. It might be every now and again you have to preach on the idea that Jesus is the Messiah. That might happen more than once. And so being able to get the background for that is important. And secondly, I think it helps you to understand the doctrine of the Messiah, how it's built, what pieces come from where, and how that became assembled over time. I think it also adds to your appreciation for the progress of revelation in Scripture and how that works. So there are a variety of benefits that come from a good biblical theological study of Jesus the Messiah.
All right. One other question as we wrap up our interview here. what other sources are out there that might be a complement to this work that we've done together?
Well, I think the major sources are actually the primary sources themselves, the actual texts that you're dealing with. And in particular, texts that come from the Second Temple Jewish period, not just the texts that we're so familiar with out of the Old Testament, because then we get a comparison and contrast of what we see in the New Testament when we go to the Psalms of Solomon 17 and 18, for example, and we see a militaristic Messiah who's simply what I like to call Arnold Schwarzenegger on steroids. You get an emphasis on a powerful Messiah, and of course Jesus' element of suffering for the Messiah stands a little bit in contrast to that. When we look at the variety of expectations tied to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the fact that they were already using Isaiah 40 as a passage for introducing the new era, for example, we get a sense of how what Jesus says fits into the world of theological reflection that was already going on when the time the New Testament was written. So I just think the primary sources, I would say, are sources that either get involved in detailed exegesis of the individual passages involved, and that involves your technical commentaries on the various books, or a look at the primary texts themselves. And the Second Temple text most people are not familiar with. There are other books like Judaism and Their Messiahs, which is edited by, among others, Jacob Neusner. It's William Smith Green and Friedrichs, I think, is the third editor. That's a very helpful look at the messianic contribution of individual pieces in the Second Temple period. So that's a valuable work to look at as well that can go alongside of it. Some of the work by John Collins on intertestamental literature and messianic expectation, those are helpful as well. But the major help comes from the ancient texts themselves.
Okay. Darrell, thank you so much for introducing us to this book, and thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time.